Thank you. Welcome, everyone. As he said, my name is Bettina Nissen. I'm a lecturer in design at the University of Edinburgh. And I'm here to present this paper on behalf of my co-authors from Edinburgh, from Lancaster University and the University of Manchester, who I believe are somewhere at the back of the room as well. And in this paper, we're exploring kind of aspects of consent decision-making practices and delegation through the design of use of a physical questionnaire that we've entitled Trustfall, which I'll talk to you in a little bit. First of all, though, to set the context. As you probably, or quite a lot of you probably know, meaningful user consent is increasingly problematic, especially with the increasing digital devices and services around us, and is kind of rooted in the idea of individual control, of informed consent and individual decision making. So we've been looking at alternative approaches with delegating consent decisions to an ecosystem of third parties. And to kind of start off with some of the context, privacy and consent studies have been done in many disciplines today, including HCI, and have been seen as to be increasingly complex and contextual issues, and that are kind of guided by a lot of temporal, social, cognitive, and material factors. But the kind of underlying narrative still remains that it is about individual control. This has kind of been, we can see this in kind of a lot of the click-wrap agreements culture that we all know very well on the internet. But the kind of discourse is changing a little bit of like how can we rethink some of these practices. And the discourse is changing and moving from like the individualized, user-centric approaches to more kind of collective decision-making. And this is something we've wanted to explore a little bit further. So we've identified or looked at other practices or other kind of studies that have identified these kind of four privacy intermediaries. So, for example, the community and crowd-based system, and you can read about those more in the paper. Machine learning systems or automated agents, experts-based system, or nominated individuals for people, like, for example, parents for children. So these are the kind of four main categories besides the status quo of making decisions ourselves that we wanted to explore. And in order to do that, we needed to think about kind of the context or scenarios that we could look into. As we know, that is a contextual issue. So we've kind of developed or designed 6 scenarios based on established frameworks around privacy dimensions by Beate Rössler. And for the time being, I'm just going to mention that the highlighted scenarios are the 6 scenarios that we've that are the abbreviations really of the scenarios that I'll refer to later, and you can see the details of this in the paper as well. So to explore these kind of contexts and what may seem like another fairly dry survey or questions to ask people, we wanted to move away from the adding more clicks and consents, traditional consent decisions, to just sending out surveys to participants, and wanted to make something that's more engaging to a wider audience. So we looked at physical questionnaires, and there's quite a history in HCI, to explore kind of playful and experiential ways of gaining feedback from different audiences. So we've learned from some of these and taken some of the considerations from this work into account to develop our design, which we call Trustfall, to allow for a more socially rich engagement with the subject matter. That it's not just about us taking data or feedback from audiences, but it offers a more kind of mutual exchange for us as researchers to engage with the participants, and for the participants or for the visitors as well to gain a more kind of experiential aspect, or kind of part of the survey, to kind of really think about what it is like to be put on the spot in these kind of consent decisions that we're all kind of facing. And just to give you kind of an idea of how this device or how Trustfall works, I'll just show a kind of short video that introduces Trustfall. Hopefully it's not too loud. So this is the kind of arcade-style game that we developed, where people could had light up buttons. And so initially we showed them the terms and conditions of our research study and asked them to agree or not agree, and then showed them how little time it took them to read them. So that's usually the response we got as well. And then this kind of ball was dropped into the material. We gathered a little bit of demographic information, as well as then asking one out of the kind of the 6 random questions. And when people responded, the ball would be dropping into the next section. And that kind of happened 3 times. That each visitor or participant was asked 3 randomized questions, and based on their random responses, or the kind of not random responses, but the responses, the ball dropped into the next section. Until at the end they could then, once they finished the 3 questions, receive this ball, which initially had sweets in them, which we quickly stopped doing because kids were just coming back for the sweets. So we basically installed this, whoops, now it's replaying. So when we installed this at the Edinburgh International Festival, it's a very busy kind of area, centrally located with local visitors as well as kind of international visitors to the festival. We kind of collected quite a lot of data, 1,749 interactions on Trustfall with follow-up questionnaires and field observations. But because it was installed in this kind of public-facing open exhibition where visitors can come in, then we obviously had a lot of noise to deal with, especially with kids just wanting to press buttons. So we had to do quite a lot of noise filtering and pre-processing before we could analyze that data. And I'll refer to the paper here because it'll take too much time to talk about the details. But we ended up with 565 kind of unique transaction or valid interactions, and then 44 questionnaires and 7 days of field observations. These field observations we've kind of used just to contextualize the information and understand what was happening. So we've found mostly kind of individual pairs or groups who were using Trustfall, and quite often, as you all, I think, did earlier, the terms and conditions provocation was greeted with laughter, surprise, sometimes with a feeling of being busted or a conversation of "I told you so." And generally, I guess there's a kind of an example here of a conversation about who people would trust with certain data amongst people of 2 or 3. So this is kind of to contextualize the data that I'm now going to go into a little bit of analyzing. We've kind of really wanted to look at if people were prepared to delegate decisions and in which scenarios. So overall, we found it was more or less 50-50 between keeping control to themselves or delegating out. And it obviously differed depending on the scenario. So most prominently, 61% for entertainment history, and least common 37% for the browsing history. And from that, we wanted to look a little bit more into who people would trust for these different scenarios. So we split up per scenario the choices, excluding myself. At the bottom, you can see the 4 different delegation choices. And we found that for the most popular one, for example, the entertainment history and browsing history, was the friend as delegation choice, whereas expert were chosen quite often for the health data, location data, or contact lists. But both AI and crowd was least popular, with AI kind of closely following it. And just to make sure we weren't just reading something into the data, we wanted to see if people just clicked the same choice over and over again because there was buttons, or if they really considered what they were doing. So on the left, you can see the number of identical choices. So there was quite a range between people choosing different options 3 times, or the same one 3 times, but predominantly people were choosing the same option twice. And and on the right you can also see there's a kind of a similar delegation choice between friend and expert, and the AI crowd, with the crowd being a little bit less. So again, there's more analysis in the paper, seeing that I'm going to be short on time. So the follow-up questionnaires that we did to then think about a little bit more of like current practices, behaviors that people, or how people perceive their own practices and behaviors. We did this kind of fairly open-ended questionnaire with a few kind of ranking or checkbox options, and that we gave to 44 people. And so firstly, in relation to their own practices when agreeing to terms and conditions, most people, around 80%, don't ever or just sometimes read terms and conditions, which I think is probably something we all know. But they were general themes around the kind of factors that go into their decision-making, of the importance of data, who the recipients were, and the usage. Alongside this, they were naming things like the reputation, recognizability, and establishedness of companies, and as factors of trusting them. To really think about, I guess, the service, how the service, or if the data that the service requires is legitimate or plausible. And the second kind of theme we looked at is more around, I guess, current delegation practices and thoughts, which to some extent mirror some of the interactions that we've already seen in Trustfall. But also was talking about the kind of their own judgment that often is subjective or includes biases as well. So just before I wrap up, I just want to highlight some of the limitations of this study. So obviously this in-the-wild deployment is always tricky. There's always a lot of noise and interactions that are hard to kind of to really to think about when we're trying to get to, I guess, rigorous or robust data. So we've developed, I guess, a fairly detailed system or method to filter the data afterwards to try to get to a kind of meaningful analysis afterwards. Secondly, the choices of our scenarios are obviously limited, and the delegation options that we presented to the participants also has its limitations in terms of wording. For example, the word crowd might need a little bit more either framing or potentially unpicking of saying, well, if we had used the word community, maybe we would have gotten different results there. And equally, we didn't really intended to conflate this kind of complex behavior of or advice and actual decision-making behaviors. But so we wanted to just acknowledge that there should be more of an distinction between the two. So just to summarize or to conclude our work, our public engagement with this kind of physical questionnaire of Trustfall has shown that people were prepared to delegate to more or less, in more or less ways, depending really on the delegation choices and the kind of contextual scenarios and data information that was given, or how the data was shared. So we proposed in our paper that instead of increasingly closing consent decisions down and basically burdening individuals with more and more consent decisions, we may want to reconsider this perspective and open up these decisions beyond the individual to offer more collective, flexible tools to make informed choices, not just when to consent, but when to delegate and when maybe to automate decision-making. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions for the speaker?
Yeah, repeat the question. Yeah, I'll repeat the question.
Tradition dictates
Just a second before you ask. Can you all fill in the seats in the middle so that people who are standing can find seats?
Is the audio on the live stream people operating?
This room's got audio problems. We have to wait until the session's over. Okay.
That's not okay.
Sorry, Dan Lofton, Carnegie Mellon. Thanks, Bettina. That was really interesting. The question I had really was that do you think that almost the kind of, not confusion exactly, but being presented with something where you have to make decisions about would I do this or would I do that, or what even is an AI/bot, or like the kind of almost the sort of, it feels like you've replicated the confusion that people face. I don't mean that in a negative way, but it's almost like being given these questions where you're kind of like, how do I consent to this? I'm not sure. Like that seems to be replicating the actual kind of stress of the real life decision making. I'm just wondering whether that affects the kind of, whether that's like, is that, I mean, it's not necessarily a limitation, but it's almost like, I don't know, that seems to be an element of it.
Yeah. I don't know if that is more of a comment than a question, and I don't know if I can repeat this in one sentence, but it's, I guess, looking at the similarities between the maybe ambiguity of some of these questions and answers in relation to our decision-making or consent decision practices generally when we actually have to, or when we actually accept something. Generally it was part of the design as well. I think there is always a bit of ambiguity and unknownness when we make these decisions. No one actually tells us if there is an AI or if there is a bot behind some systems that we use. So I think, in that sense, there is definitely similarities to the experience, and that what we try to do with this questionnaire as well. That it's not just answering a survey, but kind of really being in that moment of like other people asking us, we sign up to this, but I don't actually know what it does, but I just want to do this because it's quick and I want the candy. So I click yes. And then being confronted, I think that being confronted with the terms and conditions initially actually made people more aware, and they were actually reading some of the scenarios more than they maybe would have done if we hadn't had that moment. So I think that's something that is quite interesting to explore a bit more of, like, what are these, and they're kind of, they're subtle and really difficult and complex issues that, go into this. Yeah.
I think you touched on something that I've got in my head a little bit towards the end in the limitations, but I wonder how much you think the choice people made was down to their lack of understanding of what crowd and AI decision-making actually means, because it's quite intuitive to understand what an expert-based delegation would mean, or delegating to a friend would mean. And did you have any kind of explanation of those 4 different categories?
No, we didn't have any explanation. We only had the words because we thought it would get too complicated and on the screen. I agree. The word crowd, I think, was a little bit ambiguous and vague, although I think most people use crowd-based systems already, even if they're not aware of them. And in the follow-up or questionnaire and conversation, we found as well that AI bot, that there was more reservations for people asking, well, it depends, who created it, what does it do. So I guess it's hard to be more specific with something that's currently still in development, or kind of there's so many different versions.
Thank you.
That answers your question.
We have time for one more question.
There's another.
I'm happy to go again if no one else is up. So I'm, of course, an ignorant American, so I don't really know a lot about the European privacy. But I'm curious what they might say about the idea of delegating consent, right? So it might be that from a legal standpoint, if I delegate consent, maybe I haven't really consented at all. It'd be useful to know what you or other people are thinking about that in this space.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was kind of somewhat referring to, the limitations as well, that we were just exploring, I guess, in this process as well. It's like it's more advice than it is actual consent, because the actual consent still probably has to happen by the individual. At the moment, it's more an exploration of maybe where we could take the system in the future, and if there is a system where I can train my own bot to accept certain things that I know, and I know how it works, and it's transparent, and there is more oversight, rather than blindly trusting the crowd. So I think that really depends on how that might be implemented in the future.
Let's thank us.
Sorry. I think, are we out of time?
We're out of time.
Sorry.
You can.
See me later.
Let's thank our speaker again.